Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at slavery, something that is one of the more defining concepts of the United States history, especially prior to 1860, and the peculiar institution that it was. So, let's get started. The term, the peculiar institution, is what Southern folks called slavery, and it really was a unique concept of this time and place in that it was contradictory to so many aspects of the American experience. The boundary line between the free states and slave states would become known as the Mason-Dixon line, and by the dawn of the American Civil War, there are 4 million slaves in the United States, representing about a third of the total population. And if you look in the South, that number goes up to half of the total population will be a slave. With the development of new technologies, we see that cotton is going to replace sugar as the main production element in the South. And it was so valuable that the production of cotton feeds the desire to have more slaves to work the cotton, which in turn makes so much money. It's a vicious cycle. The more slaves you have, the more cotton you can produce. The more cotton you can produce, the more money you can make. Therefore, you justify having and needing more slaves. The practice of bringing slaves from Africa was legal in this country until 1808, but it was still legal to sell slaves that were born anywhere in the Americas. So not just in the United States. If a slave was born in Brazil or the West Indies, they could be sold in Georgia just as easily. The slave trade was open, and there were slave auctions that happened just as much as any other auction. With this other YouTube link video, there will be another one about slave auctions that'll appear just under this. I would highly encourage take a look at it to get a real idea of what these experiences were and how terrible they were. Prior to the Civil War, the South was not really a South. There were lots of different the Souths. And typically we can say that the Civil War is what brought them all together. As a general look, southern cities were usually small. They were areas to transport or to do shipping. There's not a lot of business. There's not a lot of industry. It is still exceedingly rural, especially by the dawn of 1860. The exception to this will be New Orleans, with a population of almost 170,000, and 40% of that population being born outside of the United States. New Orleans will maintain a lot of its French influences and cultural infrastructure. When you look at the South, there really are going to be 3 distinct regions of the South. The first one is going to be your border South. This is going to be Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And generally, the further north you are, the climate is cooler and there are fewer slaves in the area. The farther south you're going to go, you're going to notice more slaves. There's less plantations here. There's very little cotton because of the climate here. It's cooler. So instead of cotton, you've got tobacco. Slaves are going to make up about 17% of the population. 22% of people will own slaves, but only 1% will own more than 20 slaves. The Middle South, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, are going to function like the border South and the lower South, the deep South. Because they're in between geographically, they kind of take both cultural cues and economic cues from both. In this region, slaves make up about 30% of the population, 36% of the population owns slaves, and 14% of the total population owns more than 20 slaves. And then finally, you've got the deep South, the lower South, South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. This is the cotton belt. 95% of the cotton for the nation is grown here. This is where the secession begins. It starts with South Carolina. Slaves make up 47% of the population. 42% of the population own slaves, and 62% of those people who own slaves own more than 20 slaves. When you look at the people who are going to defend slavery, it's going to come from your average person in the South. Most Southern families did not have slaves for a couple of reasons. Number one is you usually need a large farm, a large plantation to justify having slaves. 40 acres is enough that a family can run it easily enough. And secondly, slaves are not cheap. If you factor in the cost of inflation, it's like buying a brand new car is buying a slave. And since most families can't, sure, here's 30 grand, 40 grand, drop it right out of their pockets, most won't have it. There's the dream of upward mobility for your plain white folks. The idea is, someday I'm going to be part of that rich planter class, and at the very least, I know I'm not a slave. The planter class was the apex of Southern society. There are less than 40,000 families that are going to make this up. You're considered part of the planter class if you have more than 20 slaves. And this is really the very, very wealthy, very, very powerful people in the South. Typically, this group does not like the North because the planters view the North as evil because the North uses industry to maintain labor, which is extremely hypocritical considering that the South uses humans as labor, but didn't see a problem with that. The planters usually looked at business as an inferior way to make money, especially over agriculture. This is where we see the big opulent Southern plantation homes, dresses, your stories like Gone with the Wind. This is the family class that we're talking about, your very, very wealthy families. There's a lot of different questions of how you should treat your slaves, and one of the more popular ones was the paternalist ethos, which says basically you treat your slaves like you would treat your children. You, which kind of masks how brutal it is, and it gives you justification to treat your slaves badly if they are acting in a manner you do not appreciate. The idea was that you had to treat slaves like this because they were inferior mentally and physically to white folk. And there was scientific justification. I'm sorry if you can't tell my sarcasm in there, that was used to justify this. If you looked at who had more control in the family unit between a man and a wife, a Southern family, a planter family, yeah, the man has more power over the wife, but the wife typically has more authority over the slaves. In a Southern home, if you have, well, in planter home especially, field hand slaves, usually the father of the white family isn't out there observing and disciplining him. That's an overseer's job. But inside the house, any house slave was to be disciplined by the white mistress of the house. Aside from the idea of owning slaves, we see some big differing cultural concepts that was an acceptable thing, like the code of honor. If your honor was infringed or if your honor had been sullied, then it was perfectly justifiable for you to challenge another person to a duel. And this was an old Southern tradition that still hung around, where two individuals would defend that honor by each of them having a pistol. They take 10 steps in opposite directions, they turn and they fire. Each person has one shot. And and that's it. The thought is, if you are brave enough to stand there and be willing to be shot, your honor has been restored. Even if you don't hit the other person. We see that there's plenty of stories of people who, both of them, they take 10 steps, they pull, and then they both fire, but both of them, intentionally miss by a mile, and it's still considered, oh, okay, then, everything's fine. But if you take 10 steps, turn and fire and murder the other person, you are not held accountable for that crime at all. The pro-slavery argument had a lot of components to it. The most obvious one is race-based. Sometimes it's based on historical slavery, that there has always been slavery in the history of mankind. Sometimes slavery is referenced being in the Bible as a justification that slavery can still exist. The other pro-slavery argument is an economic one. Without the labor to provide the crop finished, then the economy would collapse. In the Caribbean isles, in Latin America, in the West Indies, over time they had become independent and typically ended slavery. Most of these are going to use gradual emancipation. When the British government outlaws slavery in their colonies in 1833, they had over 20 million people, or they had freed all their slaves in under 5 years and gave money to the owners if they freed them faster. Southerners looked at the Caribbean islands and the West Indies and said, after abolition, a lot of those economies kind of took a downward spiral, and that's why we can't have that happen here. And one of the reasons was a lot of the slaves in those West Indies islands, they left. And when you didn't have as many workers doing the workload, yes, your economy is going to suffer. By 1840, slavery is legal in Mexico, throughout Central America, in Chile. The only countries that are still going to have slavery after that will be Cuba, Puerto Rico, Brazil, and the United States. The idea of having slavery at the same time you're arguing for liberty is definitely a weird contradiction. Some individuals are going to say that freedom is a privilege, not a right, and the suppression of one group was a fundamental part of being human. And this is going to continue to be an argument that is baseless as time moves on. Also, something that's argued at this time is that African Americans should stay slaves because they were quote unquote happy, because they didn't have to worry about money, they didn't have to worry about rent, they didn't have to worry about all those other elements that a civilized society would have to worry about. And oh boy, howdy, this was not good. When it comes to legal rights, very few slaves actually had legal rights. You couldn't legally kill a slave unless you're defending yourself. But, slaves are not considered humans, they're considered property. So if a slave was giving you trouble, you could just sell that person. And the fear of being separated from a family unit, whether by blood or by association, would be enough to sometimes change people's attitudes. Slaves were not able to testify against white people, carry a gun, leave a farm or a plantation without permission. They were not allowed to learn how to read. They couldn't gather without a white person around. And one of these, the law really does not help or side with slaves at all, as you would imagine. Perfect example of this was the trial of Celia, a slave who killed her master in 1855. She was being raped by him, and she fought him off and killed him. The court says, though, that it was not self-defense because she was not legally a woman. She was sentenced to die, but she was also pregnant because of the rape, and she was ordered that she would live until she gave birth, and then she was executed. When you look at the conditions of the slave life in the United States, it's better than some places. By no means does this mean it's good. I'm just pointing out that other places had it even worse than the United States did. Typically, slave families in the United States had more food, better working conditions because working on sugar is tremendously bad. Lots of ways to be crushed and burned and horribly mutilated. But it's also a lot harder to be free here. In Brazil, for example, working in sugar or coffee or the silver mines, which that was very bad because you have to also work with aluminum nitrate, and that can make you go crazy. About half the slave owners ultimately would just free their slaves at the time of their death. But in the South, it got harder and harder to free your slaves. Eventually, you had to get state legislature involved if you wanted to do so. If you were African American and free and living in the South, there's about 500,000 people who that's going to pertain to. Most of those people are going to be free, but free is a really misleading concept because they couldn't have all the rights of citizenship either. They couldn't vote. They couldn't testify in court. They couldn't serve in a jury. They couldn't own a dog. They couldn't own a gun. They couldn't buy liquor. They can't hit a white person, even in self-defense. And they have to carry paperwork on them at all times saying, yes, I am a free person. And if they were arrested, let's just say that they're out and about, they go to the store to get anything, and they don't have the right papers on them, and they're detained, they could potentially be sold into slavery again. Slave labor is long hours. The plantation, the big ones, they're self-contained communities. There's lots of different jobs that happen here. Slaves are also hired out by the government to build roads, to build public buildings, and some slave owners would actually rent out their slaves for extra help, or during the lull times of the crops. The two main types of labor system that we see when it comes to slave labor is either gang labor or task labor. And gang labor is where an entire group of slaves all works until a job is done. An overseer, a slave driver, will set the pace for the work. Task labor is different, where individual slaves are assigned individual tasks. And once your tasks are done for the day, you are done. We see that with the fact that slavery was around for as long as it was around, there develops a very unique slave culture, one that's based on family, one that is based on religion, and a lot of these ideas are passed from generation to generation and have an idea of being oneself and overcoming adversity. We see a lot of these slave cultures draw on the mix of African traditions, African heritage, the West Indies cultures, the Native American cultures, the indigenous white American cultures, and how they kind of all mixed together. We see music, dance, worship, medicine, the heavy use of rhythm, heavy use of drums. We see the adaptation of and invention of musical instruments like the banjo. Eventually, on the other side of slavery, this style of music that was slave music becomes jazz, becomes the basis for blues, for rhythm and blues, for rock and roll, for what we call the American music experience today. The roots of it are here. Laws and the legal system, as you can probably imagine, didn't recognize slave marriages or a slave family. Most slaves did marry, and usually were marriages went on and lasted forever. Kinship was very strong, and family units were made up of both the blood family as well as the communal family. And that communal family extended to different plantations, extended to different states, so that the idea of family was something very universal. When it was time to sell slaves, if you were selling slaves, it didn't matter about keeping a slave together. It didn't matter if you were keeping a family together. There's stories of kids at the age of 10 who are put in to enter the slave workforce. A very important part of slave culture was that slaves were required to become Christian. And many slaves did become Christian. Some paid lip service to um, confessionals and baptismals, and some we see blend Christianity with some of the African traditions, specifically out of West Africa. Use of music, use of movement, use of call and response, worship. And sometimes we are going to get branches of Christianity that are heavily influenced by this. And in some cases, we get entirely different religions that are amalgamations of this, like voodoo, for example. Most plantations have a preacher who is self-taught, who knows the stories of the Bible, and is referred to as this. Most slaves knew that they were not able to confront the institution of slavery and hope to survive, but they still dreamed of freedom. The songs, the use of spirituality, the goal of equality and liberation, all were used to motivate people that, it was going to get better. And that as bad as it is, there's ways to resist it. And there's a lot of different ways that different slaves would resist the systems. It might be to work slower, it might be to break tools, to abuse animals, to steal food, to fake being sick, and sometimes it meant you poison the people who own you. Sometimes it means you burn their house down. Sometimes it means you kill an entire family. And sometimes it means running away. And we don't know exactly how many slaves ran away. The estimate is that there's about 1,000 people a year who did so. Most of the people who run are going to be young men who run. Women were less willing to leave if they had children. And if you wanted to escape, the big limiting factor is, where am I? Where do I need to go? And yes, okay, north, that's great, but how far is north? If you were in a border state, you have a much better chance to escape, but there were underground railroads the Underground Railroad itself was this network of abolitionists who hid slaves to get them from free station to free station. I need to make sure everyone understands the Underground Railroad was not a subterranean train network. It's just a term used. The number of people who were escaping, though, running away, did lead states to pass the fugitive slave laws. And this meant that for a slave to be granted freedom, they they didn't necessarily just have to leave their state. In some cases, they had to leave the United States. Some of these fugitive slave laws said that if you run away, your former owner could pursue you anywhere in the United States. And if a slave owner thought a person was a slave and was their slave, all it took was for him to point at that person and say, hey, you were my slave and you ran away. And in some cases that's it. And the next thing you know, you're enslaved. There's a couple big slave rebellions that happen, and that's going to be our wrap up for today. The first is the Amistad, which was a slave ship that was off the coast of Long Island. The slaves break free, they take control of the ship, and they try to get back to Africa. But they are not able to before the ship is basically taken back, and they're all arrested. The slaves sue for freedom, and they sue and are successful in this suit because principally they were taken from Africa in 1839. And by 1839, this was illegal. That's the justification for why they were able to go. Big slave rebellions didn't happen too often because they were pretty likely to end in everyone dead. And except for the Amistad was a unique situation where the slaves were able to go free, but a lot of these ended in not that happening. One of these was the Denmark-Vesey attempt, and it happens in 1822, where the slave, a guy named Denmark Vesey, was planning a massive slave revolt. His idea was if all the slaves across the South rose up, then, then there'd be no way to stop us all. He was caught. His slave revolution never happens. He and 35 others are publicly hung. And usually the torture, execution, punishment for slaves is usually public as a threat to everyone. The most famous slave revolt that ever happened was NAT Turners Revolt. And Turner was a preacher. He used religious mysticism. He was well educated. He actually could read. And he said that slaves basically come with me. And they went from plantation to plantation, killing all the white folk. And eventually they kill over 60 different people, in some cases entire families. He is caught, he is killed, and 200 other slaves that he had been in contact were also killed. The reason was they wanted to make sure that this man's ideas didn't spread. This was the last large-scale rebellion in the South. Following this, we see that there's a lot tighter control on slavery. And even the idea of ending slavery anyway was like looked at with shock, and that was, oh, how could we? So today we took a look at slavery as an institution in the mid to late 19th century. As you can tell from where this is going, there's no way this situation ends other than a war. A war that is going to divide this nation, a war that is not so civil. So, that being said, ladies and gentlemen, hope you learned something today. I'll see you next time.